travelers began vanishing along Scotland's Galloway coast, long before pamphlets named Sawney Bean, and a royal writ sealed what searchers found in a sea cave. Tonight we reopen that file. This is not about campfire gore. It is about how terrain, law, and hunger built a trap polite society tried to forget. Stay with me, and by the end you will decide how much of the tale was legend and how much was lived. If this approach to dark history resonates, please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. In the mist-shrouded hills of Scotland, where the wind moves like a voice through the heather and the rocks themselves seem to remember, one name survives as a warning: Sawney Bean. The story is older than most written records that mention it, part legend and part legal memorandum, whispered by travelers who survived coastal roads and echoed by pamphleteers who loved a good horror. Our task is not to embellish the gore, but to reconstruct the world that allowed such a tale to take root, a coastline of coves and caves, a tangle of feudal duties and lax enforcement, winters that made hunger a second religion. In that environment, according to sources ranging from 18th century broadsides to later court summaries, a family withdrew from society and learned to live on its margins, and then, if the reports are to be believed, learned to live on everyone else. The hook is stark. Disappearances along the Galloway coast multiply. Search parties find nothing. A young couple escapes an ambush and brings a cavalry of witnesses to a cave. Inside are the remains of dozens, some say hundreds of victims preserved against the seasons. It reads like a morality play, or a nightmare that tidy communities tell themselves about the wilderness just beyond the hedge. Yet every part of the tradition anchors itself in geographical fact. The cave exists. The roads were dangerous. The justice system could be spectacularly brutal once it finally woke up. Whether the tally of victims was inflated for shock or not, the story functions as a map of anxieties: strangers on the road, the border between kinship and secrecy, the fragility of oversight in a hard land. Before we go further, a clarification that will guide the rest of this investigation. Historians disagree about the strict historicity of Sawney Bean. Some place him in the reign of James VI, others in a fuzzier medieval past. The archives are fragmentary. Popular retellings often contradict each other. That uncertainty is not a weakness for our purposes, it is the point. The persistence of the Bean tradition reveals how communities process fear and enforce boundaries. Tonight we will track the narrative along 3 lines at once: what the sources say happened, what the landscape made possible, and why people kept retelling it. In doing so, we avoid both naive belief and easy dismissal, attending instead to how horror stories are built and why they stay. Imagine the approach to Benin Head after dark. Sea spray rides the wind like dust. The path narrows between gorse and cliff, every footfall a decision. In that uncertainty, a small party of men steps out from shadow with practiced economy. They do not shout. They do not brandish banners. They move as if they have done this before, because according to the tradition, they have. The attack is quick, the retreat quicker, and the trail vanishes under the tide. No innkeeper sees a stranger. No parish grave receives a body. It is a crime scene designed by the coastline itself. The supposed architect of this method was Alexander Sawney Bean, a man who in most accounts abandoned craft and community to live by theft and violence. He took a partner who shared his rejection of ordinary life. Together they discovered a cave whose mouth drowned twice daily, sealing them in during high tide and scrubbing away tracks. There, removed from markets and law, they built a routine that grew into a household. Children arrived. Those children paired with each other. The family became its own economy, feeding not on fields but on the road. This is the detail modern readers recoil from, not only for its brutality, but for its logistics, a parallel society nesting in a hole in the rock, organized enough to last decades. All strong hooks need a promise, and here it is. Across the next chapters we will trace how that household supposedly worked, why travelers kept vanishing without full alarm, what a chance escape revealed, and how a crown determined to make an example closed the book. We will read the legend against the cave's physical constraints and the period's legal practices, so that by the end, you can decide how much is literal and how much is liturgy. Now, into the cave. According to the dominant tradition, the Bean household started with 2 people and became several dozen within a generation. Isolation does not erase culture, it curdles it. The cave quickly divided into zones, each shaped by necessity. Near the mouth, drying racks for clothing and supplies taken from the road. Deeper in, an area given over to the preservation of meat in ways that do not require spice or heavy equipment, smoke, salt, airflow, cool stone. In the rear chambers, where the sea's thunder became a constant heartbeat, bedding lay in clusters. Torches and tallow candles provided light. The smell, animal fat, damp wool, and the iron of the sea would have been a second weather. Daily life moved to the rhythm of tide tables and moon phases. At low tide, the eldest scouted the headland, checking for driftwood, signs of patrols, and the subtle changes wind carved into dunes. Tools were simple, but maintained like reliquaries: knives whetted on smooth stones, hooks rebent in coals, ropes dried and coiled so that a single frayed strand would not betray the whole. No member of the household owned anything in the usual sense. Use replaced possession. A child borrowed a cloak because she needed to watch the road, not because it was hers. Roles hardened with age. Men planned approaches and retreats. Women kept the household's second economy running, a calculus of smoke, salt, cloth, and silence. Children learned to mimic seabirds so that a cry on the headland could pass as nature. Stories served as training manuals. One tale warned that careless footsteps near the mouth echoed downslope like a drum. Another encoded the rule that a fire must never touch the ceiling's damp crust, or the cave would rain soot for a week. Skill was not ornament, but survival. To outsiders, the household reads as a caricature of depravity. Inside, it would have felt orderly. Scarcity forces order. Meals were rationed with the strictness of a siege. Light was hoarded. Even laughter had rules. Fights were punished, not because they were immoral, but because noise traveled. When weather trapped them underground for days, elders told the origin story again, how a rejection of village life became a craft of living by the road. The moral, inverted though it was, remained constant. The world outside cannot be trusted. The family must be sufficient. Training was constant and concrete. Children practiced tying knots blindfolded, snuffing candles with pinched fingers, and walking ankle-deep through pools without a splash. They learned to read cloud ceilings for incoming gales, and to count heartbeats while holding their breath, useful when the tide filled the entrance and the cave became a lung with no mouth. Failure was corrected without debate. "Do it again," an elder would say, and the lesson continued until the task was done in silence. The household also maintained a rough ledger, scratched on slate and smoothed by seawater, a list of stores, of what could be traded to sympathetic or ignorant intermediaries, of what must be destroyed to erase identity. Cloth and tools might pass hand to hand, named possessions could not. A ring with initials was broken, the pieces set aside to be thrown into the sea on a dark night. In this way, the family built a rulebook of negation, what not to keep, what never to say, which questions from outsiders required a blank face and a turned back. We stress the logistics because the legend is sometimes treated as if it could happen anywhere at any time. It could not. It required a coastline whose caves inhale and exhale, a legal patchwork too thin for consistent patrols, and an economy in which travelers often moved alone and uncounted. The Bean household, as told, was less a miracle of evil than an exploitation of place. The tide hid their tracks, the cliffs silenced their noise, hunger excused what conscience should have stopped. That combination, terrain, neglect, need, built a home in stone. And if the numbers in later broadsides seem impossible, the method does not. Patience, secrecy, and a landscape that assisted both. Think of this not as a monster tale, but as a case study in how geography can become an accomplice when oversight looks away for too long. The systematic nature of the operation becomes clearest in the months that precede the fall. Disappearances concentrate along predictable corridors, yet evidence is scarce. Authorities interrogate innkeepers, tinkers, and ferrymen. Patrols are mounted and then abandoned as budgets tighten. Rumor turns to folk prophylaxis. Travel in groups, carry a lantern, avoid the cliffs when the moon is new. The clan, if the sources speak true, adjusted accordingly, splitting into small hunting parties that could dissolve into brush at the first alarm. The cave's tidal mouth did more than conceal tracks. It acted as a kill switch. If trouble came too close, the sea closed the door and the family waited, lanterns snuffed while the search passed above. Inside, what modern writers might call processing became routine. We spare the details. What matters is logistics. Tools were maintained, tasks divided, schedules kept. Stolen goods moved outward through informal markets. Cloth, tools, coins, never in bulk, always as if they were leftovers from long trading. The absence that haunts the record is testimony. No member of the clan is documented as a defector. That silence either signals the strength of their isolation or the later invention of the tale. In both interpretations, the effect on nearby communities is the same. Uncertainty spreads faster than fear, and uncertainty changes behavior. Roads empty earlier. Church bells ring a beat longer at dusk. Even the rumors show design. When villagers whispered of lights on the headland, the family leaned into the superstition, sometimes leaving a lantern half-shielded near a boggy stretch so that passers-by would blame marsh fire and quicken their pace. A false trail here, a scrap of cloth there. Details sufficient to keep attention diffuse without guiding it anywhere useful. What we would now call misdirection was for them just another task on the tide chart: set decoys at dusk, retrieve at dawn. Meanwhile, the coast itself collaborated. Caves along Benin Head exhale when the pressure outside drops, breathing a faint, rhythmic draft through fissures in the stone. Searchers unfamiliar with the phenomenon find it eerie. Locals barely notice. For a hidden household, that draft was a message system and a warning both. A sudden shift in the cave's breath meant storm surge or a wind change that could carry smoke the wrong way. On such days, the family went dark and silent, a small community turning itself into a shadow until conditions steadied. If this portrait seems too organized, remember that chaos cannot last for decades. Only routine survives the long haul, and routine is exactly what the legend insists upon. By the time the disappearances reached a scale that alarmed officials, the family had optimized every step they could control and minimized every trace they could not. The coast handled the rest. Jurisdiction failed in ways that feel familiar across centuries. Parish constables could search within their bounds but not over the next ridge without permission. Sheriffs relied on unpaid labor from neighbors who were reluctant to spend nights on cliff paths. When livestock went missing, suspicion fell on the usual suspects: vagrants, traveling smiths, the rougher sort of sailors on leave. One widow who kept a roadside alehouse found her shutters marked with chalk, a sign from fearful neighbors that she should close at dusk or be blamed for the next disappearance. Fear builds stories the way frost builds on heather, quietly and everywhere at once. Economies felt the pressure. Fares scheduled earlier, closing bells. Merchants paid for hired riders to travel beside them as far as the next parish. A few entrepreneurial men offered protection that amounted to walking with a spear and collecting coin. None of it addressed the coastline itself, which remained a maze designed for ambush. Even when a patrol reached the right headland, the tide could erase the single piece of evidence that would have made sense of everything, that open mouth of stone-swallowing footprints by the hour. In time, more energy went into custom, warnings and superstitions than into investigation. Psychology mattered as well. Communities explain the unexplainable by choosing culprits they can see. Outsiders became scapegoats because they were present, while the truly hidden remained myth. The Bean legend thrives on that misdirection. It suggests a population willing to believe anything, except that the problem lived in the cliff itself. If a story is unbelievable enough, it can hide in plain sight. Listeners label it nonsense and walk past the cave that is breathing behind them. If you want more careful, myth versus evidence investigations like this, hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep unearthing the cases history tries to forget. The pivot arrives with what countless retellings call the escape of the couple. A man and woman return from a fair along the coastal road as dusk burns to iron. The ambush is sudden, shadows resolving into bodies, horses panicking, hands on leather and reins. In several versions, the man fights with a small sword while the woman keeps her mount between them and the attackers. In others, the attackers misjudge the number of riders. What matters is the noise. A larger party lagging behind hears the struggle and gallops forward. The hunters cannot complete their work cleanly. They retreat. For the first time, the secrecy that tide and stone had guaranteed cracks under a witness's scream. Accounts differ in their particulars but agree in rhythm: pursuit, confusion, and a desperate flight toward the nearest stead where doors were barred by instinct. The woman's statement, recorded years later in a parish chronicle, reads like breath on paper. She remembers the smell of the horses, the slide of a foot on grit, the sound leather makes when a strap is yanked too hard. She remembers a voice saying, "Back to the cliff," and another answering, "No time." Those details do not prove the legend, they prove how terror records the world. The survivors carry their story to authority, sometimes to the local laird, sometimes in sensational accounts directly to the king. A search must now be more than a patrol. Torches, dogs, and men on foot spread across the headland. Volunteers arrive with pikes and farm lanterns, some out of duty, some out of fear that the road to market will close if they do nothing. What happens next is narrated with a mixture of horror and inventory. A cave mouth found at low tide, a steep passage into chambers broader than anyone expected, the discovery of stores that prove the operation's duration. We keep our language careful here. The sources are graphic. We do not need to be. The point is scale. Whatever this place was, crime scene, mythic cautionary set, or both, it communicated longevity and order. The searchers emerge with their faces changed and their purpose fixed. From that moment, the investigation becomes a moving camp. Messengers ride to summon more men and to borrow hounds from an inland estate. The dogs pull at their leads, eager until the scent dies at the waterline. Then they balk, confused, as if the world ended at foam. An old fisherman shakes his head and points to the cliff. "There are holes along here that breathe," he says in one account. "Find the place where the cliff sweats at low tide." At the next ebb, lanterns descend by rope. A gust of cold air answers like a hidden lung. The first men inside describe silence so complete they could hear salt falling from the ceiling. They test the floor with poles and mark their path with chalk, as if moving through a mine. The cave opens sideways and downward, a geography built for ambush and retreat. Every object located is read for meaning. Hooks for hanging meat become evidence of industry. Piles of clothing, the record of a long theft, a ledger scratched on slate, the outline of a household. None of these things belong underground. Their presence testifies to a campaign executed with patience and chilling domestic order. Outside, the headland becomes a theater of speculation. Neighbors argue about dates and names. A grandmother insists she warned the council years ago. A ferryman claims he saw figures on the ridge but thought them shepherds. The couple, now sheltered and shaken, repeat their testimony until it hardens into a script the authorities can carry to court. In these hours, the legend takes its modern shape, not only a crime, but a story with roles for victim, villain, and rescuer, each necessary to convince a fearful public that the world is once again explainable. By dawn, the mouth of the cave is guarded, the road to market is tentatively reopened, and a rumor travels faster than any horse. The headland hid a family that fed on the kingdom. Whether the arithmetic to come is propaganda or precision hardly matters to the people who hear it. What matters is that a door they never noticed has been found, and it does not open onto the sea. It opens onto the limits of their attention. The raid that follows is cast as royal justice in motion. Whether James VI himself attended is debated. That he could have is a measure of how the case seized the imagination of the realm. Soldiers seal the exits by posting men at the cliffs and by watching the tide. Inside the cave, shock gives way to process. Prisoners are bound, the youngest crying, the elders silent. Confession, in the era's sense, is less a careful deposition than a theater of guilt. Pamphlets later print numbers that stretch belief, hundreds, then 1,000 victims, as if arithmetic could convert outrage into order. But even skeptical counts accept that something terrible had been happening for a long time without interruption. What did confession mean in this context? Not a transcript as we would expect today, but a declaration extracted in the presence of authority and witnesses, intended as much for public reassurance as for legal precision. Some statements likely mixed admission with embellishment, others were shaped by the questions asked. The result, captured in broadsides, is a document at once historical and theatrical, a narrative of guilt designed to close the circle of fear opened by the disappearances. The charge sheet grew as officers tried to fit new discoveries into existing statutes. Theft was obvious, murder assumed, conspiracy inferred. The law had little patience for the fine distinctions of a hidden household. The mere fact of its operation, its secrecy, its duration, became evidence of treasonous order, a community within the community. That framing matters because it explains the punishment's speed. The Crown was not only punishing acts, it was punishing audacity. Transport to justice became the next spectacle. In some accounts, the women were condemned in one city, and the men in another, an administrative flourish that favors narrative over logistics. Crowds gathered along the road to stare at the procession. For many, this was their first proof that the rumor was real, living faces belonging to the story that had haunted the market. Ballads soon attached names to those faces, turning individuals into symbols that could be sung and remembered. Executions are described in the blunt grammar of the period. We resist those details here not to soften the history, but to prevent the spectacle from replacing the lesson. The swiftness and severity of the sentences reveal what authorities feared most, not the crimes alone, but the possibility that such a counter-society could exist within riding distance of parishes that considered themselves civilized. Public punishment promised to repair the boundary that the headland had erased. For researchers, the most durable trail is in paper, not pamphlet. Property seized from the cave was inventoried, claimed by relatives where possible, and auctioned when names could not be traced. Parish registers record the sudden reappearance of items long assumed lost: a peddler's frame, a jeweler's hammer, a stitched purse with initials half-rubbed by salt. Court clerks noted unusual disbursements for extra torches and hired hounds. These lists, more than any sensational narration, testify to duration. Only a long operation could accumulate so many ordinary things that mattered only because someone once carried them across that road. Were the numbers inflated? Almost certainly. Did inflation serve a purpose? Absolutely. A larger tally made the case exemplary and justified expenditures that ordinary thefts never would. The caution for us is not to confuse the exaggerations of punishment with the impossibility of the crime. A smaller household operating for fewer years could still leave the same cultural scar. The legend's figures rise and fall with the needs of each retailer. The infrastructure of neglect that made the legend plausible does not. One last legal wrinkle deserves notice. Some versions place the trial under a doctrine that allowed extraordinary measures when notorious facts threatened the realm. In practice, this meant fewer procedural protections and more emphasis on public order. It is tempting to read that through modern eyes as pure overreach. It is better read as a sign of how fragile border justice felt. The Crown's message was not subtle. The coast belongs to the realm, not to households that turn tide and secrecy into government. In the paperwork, fear of geography is written as law. Aftermath is where legend and history braid most tightly. The cave becomes a site of warning. Children are told to mind their curfews. Travelers are advised to keep to the inland roads. The story begins to work on culture like salt on meat, drawing out anxieties, preserving them, hardening them into something that can be carried. Ballads pick up the rhythm. Printed accounts embroider motives. The clan's insularity is pointed to as a cause, a caution against communities that treat outsiders as contamination and secrecy as virtue. In time, the tale becomes a mirror held up to every period's fears. In one century, it is about highwaymen. In another, about the failures of local law. In ours, about what happens when rumor is louder than records. 18th century broadsides sensationalize the story for readers who might never see the Scottish coast, shifting dates and details to suit the mood of the market. Some place Sawney in the late 1400s, others a century later. Some insist on royal presence, others on civic militia. This plasticity is not a bug, it is evidence of use. A story carried by street sellers can be tuned to the anxieties of the crowd that gathers that morning. Later antiquarians argue in footnotes about chronology and quantify the possible headcount by calculating how many travelers used the road per year. They draw little maps with dotted lines for paths and neat arrows for wind. Their caution tempers the pamphleteers, but it also keeps the legend alive by refusing to dismiss it entirely. Possible, writes one, though unlikely in the sum. Possible is all a legend needs. Modern tourism adds another layer: informational plaques that speak in cautious prose, cave tours that stop where the tide would erase a misstep. Guides let silence do some of the work, pausing at the point where the ceiling lowers and the ocean's breath becomes a steady engine. Visitors emerge blinking and speak more softly for an hour without knowing why. Landscape teaches better than rhetoric. Administratively, there are ripples. Coastal patrols become more regular in the years that follow. Parishes cooperate across borders more readily. Constables are granted modest stipends for night watches that previously relied on goodwill alone. None of these reforms prove the legend, but all of them acknowledge the problem it describes. When the line between jurisdictions runs along a cliff, the cliff will win. In political argument, the tale becomes shorthand. Reformers cite it when urging centralized policing. Localists use it to argue that neglect from distant capitals leaves parishes to fend for themselves. Playwrights borrow its cave as a metaphor for any secretive institution that feeds on the public and calls it necessity. By the 19th century, the name Sawney Bean can be deployed as a one-line insult meaning brutish, insular, or beyond the pale. A legend once confined to a headland has become vocabulary evidence less of what certainly happened than of what people needed to say about danger and neglect. There is a softer afterlife, too. Folklorists collect lullabies that warn children not to wander near the sea after sunset. Sailors rename a difficult current Bean's Breath. None of these artifacts proves a crime scene. They prove memory. The cultural kind that does not depend on documents but on repetition until the lips know the line by themselves. Modern historians, alert to myth-making, keep two ledgers in their heads, one for claims that can be checked against parish books, court rolls, and property lists, another for the emotional truths the community preserved regardless of paperwork. In the first ledger, the Bean case is shadowy and inconsistent. In the second, it is crystalline. Beware isolation that curdles into rule, and beware the way neglect creates the monsters it later claims to slay. Holding both ledgers at once is the only honest way to read what came after. And there is the landscape, indifferent and exact. Walk the path at dusk and you will see how a rider could vanish in a bend of gorse. Stand at the cave mouth at low tide, and you will feel the cold breath that erases footprints. The place itself is a commentary that neither confirms nor denies. It simply demonstrates how easy it is to hide in plain geography when no one is tasked with really looking. The legacy of Sawney Bean is less about cannibalism than about attention, who receives it, who withholds it, and how absence becomes a weapon. Disappearances went unlinked because communities were fragmented and jurisdictions narrow. When authority finally looked in the right direction, it punished not only the acts but the audacity of a hidden household. As a legend, the story insists that evil thrives when oversight sleeps. As a case study, it cautions researchers to interrogate sources that confuse outrage with evidence. So what do we do with a tale that wavers between history and horror? We read it in layers. First, as an ethnography of fear, a map of how border communities imagined danger and taught caution to the next generation. Second, as a critique of administration, a reminder that when responsibility is scattered, accountability goes missing in the cracks. Third, as a study in narrative power, a demonstration that a story well told can govern behavior as effectively as any statute. The Bean legend also invites comparisons that reach beyond Scotland. Along isolated coasts and deep forests in many countries, there are tales of households that built law inward and treated outsiders as resources rather than neighbors. Some are demonstrably false, others sit atop a sediment of fact, petty banditry, missing travelers, local officials too thinly spread to respond. Each tale sets its own variables, terrain, hunger, secrecy, and solves for horror. We should not flatten those differences, but we can recognize the pattern. Neglect plus landscape can teach people the wrong lessons about what survival requires. There is a fourth layer, media. Pamphleteers needed a spectacle. Ballad makers needed a refrain. Later filmmakers wanted a frame of torchlight on stone. Each medium exaggerates what it must to hold an audience. That does not make the audience foolish, it makes them human. Stories offer emotional rehearsal for danger. In a world where roads were poorly policed and nights very dark, practicing fear together was a kind of safety net. At the same time, the legend tempts us toward a convenient moral. Monsters are out there, far away. The harder lesson is that neglect creates its own wilderness. If isolated families can drift into brutality, isolated parishes can drift into blindness. Oversight is not only a matter of budget and patrols, it is an ethic of attention that refuses to let the edges of the map become someone else's problem. For this channel, the cave becomes a method. It teaches that landscapes shape crimes, and the way we tell them. It shows how families, any families, make internal rules that can drift under pressure into something the rest of us cannot recognize. And it warns that sensational accounting often distracts from the quieter questions. Who was missing? Who looked? Who decided it was nobody's job until it was everyone's emergency? A brief geology helps explain the legend's plausibility. The Ayrshire coast is punctured by sea caves formed where softer bands of rock weather faster than their harder neighbors. Many of these chambers breathe. Pressure changes with the tide force air in and out, turning a cliff into a bellows. Smoke from a torch hugs the ceiling and disappears. Voices flatten and carry oddly. Footsteps sound closer or farther than they are. A cave with a constricted entrance and a branching interior can hide light from the headland while letting smoke escape through fissures higher up. Add a tide that seals the mouth twice a day, and you have a natural device for erasing tracks and confusing pursuers. None of this proves a household lived there. All of it explains why a search might fail until someone who knew the rhythm of the place showed where to look. Firewood, water, and waste. These three mundane needs govern whether any hidden dwelling could last. The coast provides driftwood and scrub. The cave offers seasonal pools. The tide removes what the inhabitants cannot. In winter, smoke would be the loudest betrayal, and yet in storms the whole headland smokes as spray, atomizes and mists the air. Where the land conspires to camouflage, observers grow accustomed to ambiguity. It is not that no one looked, it is that even looking has to fight the terrain. On paper, the legend's trail splits. The earliest full account most viewers encounter is an 18th century chapbook that reads like a courtroom drama written at speed. Some details there are incompatible with known legal practice, others ring true in their administrative fussiness. Later antiquarians copy and embellish. 19th century compilers fold the story into collections of Scottish curiosities. Meanwhile, parish books tell plainer stories. Missing persons noted obliquely, a cart abandoned near a headland, a sudden sermon against lawlessness delivered after a body washes ashore with no identification. If we demand notarized minutes, the Bean story collapses under its own theatricality. If we read it as a palimpsest, we begin to see how fear and fact can write over each other until neither is legible alone. Courts of the period were capable of swift collective punishment, but they were also capable of paperwork. The absence of a neat bundle of depositions has two likely explanations. Either the cases told never ran through formal channels, or the papers existed and were later lost, destroyed, or misfiled as their usefulness as propaganda waned. Both explanations fit other cases from the era. Historians therefore balance probabilities rather than certainties. The intellectual honesty is in showing the balance, not in pretending we can eliminate the unknowns with a flourish. Ethics matter in retelling. To dwell on inventories of flesh is to become the pamphleteer the legend already had. To ignore the human mechanics, the labor of hunting, the logistics of preservation, the effects on neighboring parishes, is to miss the structural lessons that make the tale valuable. Between those poles sits a careful way. Describe enough to understand, stop before the spectacle begins, and keep the focus on conditions that enable atrocity rather than the atrocity as entertainment. That ethic extends to the landscape itself. Caves are not blank stages, they are ecologies. Bats use them. Seabirds shelter near their mouths. Rare crustaceans live in their pools. Graffiti and trampling do a quiet, durable violence that no legend can justify. If you go, leave no mark. The lesson of this headland is not that hidden households deserve our curiosity. It is that attention belongs first to the living systems that outlast every story we tell about them. If this reading helped you weigh myth against terrain and text, you can help the work continue. Subscribe, share this episode with a friend who likes deep archival dives, and leave a comment with cases you want examined next. We publish careful, source-driven investigations into dark history, stories that resist easy answers but reward attention. Before we close, a practical note for researchers and travelers who may visit Bendane Head. Respect the tide tables and the local warnings. The cave that breathes is still a machine that turns carelessness into tragedy. If you carry this story with you to the shoreline, let it sharpen your senses rather than your appetite for spectacle. The lesson is vigilance, not voyeurism. Finally, an invitation to humility. Legends often outlive the documents that birthed them. When archives are incomplete, due to fire, neglect, or selective preservation, the stories communities keep can be the only remaining witness to how a place once felt. Treat those stories with skepticism, yes, but also with the respect owed to any testimony that sustained a neighborhood through difficult nights. The truth may be smaller than the legend, but it is rarely the opposite of it. If you work with this material, teacher, guide, researcher, say aloud what is known, what is inferred, and what is imagined. That simple taxonomy prevents the comfort of certainty from doing new harm. It also invites your audience to practice the same discipline the headland demands, to notice where evidence ends and story begins, and to keep looking even when the sea seems to have erased the path. Until the next chapter, mind the roads at dusk, and remember that even in daylight, the coastline still breathes. The sea erases quickly, but attention restores what neglect removes, and attention is where every good investigation begins.